forum is supported by the Columbus Dispatch, represented by, somebody wave. There he is. And their associates. The forum is presented in partnership with the Center for Community Solutions as part of their 71st Annual Human Services Institute. Community Solutions is represented here today by John Bagala and his associates. John's up here. Please thank them for their support. Now I'd like to introduce and invite John Honeck to this stage to introduce our speaker. John is a fellow and director of public policy and advocacy for the Center for Community Solutions. John?
Good afternoon. The Center for Community Solutions is pleased to partner with the Columbus Metropolitan Club on this special forum presentation. As a nonpartisan organization engaged in research and policy analysis, we welcome opportunities such as this to encourage stimulating discussions of how public policy affects people in Ohio. A biography for our speaker is in your forum flyer, so I will provide only a brief introduction. Our speaker today came to national prominence as an author with his 1984 book, Losing Ground, which has been credited as the intellectual foundation for the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. His book, The Bell Curve, which he co-authored with Richard Herrnstein, was released in 1994. His most recent book is Coming Apart, The State of White America, 1960 to 2010. It is fair to say that his analysis of class in America in this book has been acknowledged by leaders and thinkers across the partisan and political divide as incisive and worthy of serious consideration. Please welcome Charles Murray, W.H. Brady Scholar with the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., who will present the annual W.T. McCullough Address. On behalf of the Center for Community Solutions, the Columbus Dispatch, and CMC, please welcome our speaker.
I'm going to come over where they have two microphones because I am worried about how long my voice is going to hold out. And if I sound a little bit like Peter Lorre today, it's not my usual speaking style. It's forced upon me. This is my first time in Columbus. I have a, yes, I know I've been in a lot of places, and I have a map at home where I put a pin in every place that I've been. And I've been looking forward to this trip, I have to say frankly, because I don't get a chance to put a pin in the map very often, and I can because of this. Also, it's the home of my hero, Jack Nicklaus, so that's another reason to be glad to be here. I was told before lunch that I should feel free to have fun with the audience in this, and I don't know how I do that with this book that I've written. It's just, it's not a barrel of laughs. Here's the thesis. The thesis is that over the course of the last half century, we have developed classes in this country that are different in kind from classes as we have ever known them, and the continued separation into these classes threatens the American project. And by the American project, I mean the idea that has animated this country, that people should be free to live their lives as they see fit, coming together to voluntarily to jointly solve their mutual problems. It's what has made America exceptional, and I see that as being in danger. I will warn you right away that despite the sponsor of this being the Center for Community Solutions, I'm not good at solutions. Libertarians generally aren't good at solutions. But what I think is necessary at this point is a recognition of the problem. Because when we do find solutions, they are not going to come out of Washington. They are going to be cultural solutions. They are going to be changes of heart that have to occur across the nation. And doing that is difficult. What's the music? Does anybody know where that's coming? Ah, okay. So nobody can turn off anything to... I'm really hearing this. Thank you very much. I was beginning to wonder that. There are two chunks to the problem. The first chunk is the development of what I will call the new lower class, The second chunk is the development of a new upper class, and I'll take each one of them in turn because they are very different kinds of problems. First, the development of the new lower class. We have always had rich people and poor people in this country, and the rich people and poor people have always lived in somewhat different parts of town. But what characterized the United States virtually uniquely among the nations of the world was that there was participation across the socioeconomic classes in certain fundamental institutions of American life. The very best example I can give you of this is marriage. Let's go back to 1960 and compare it with 2010. In doing that, I'm going to have a couple of specifications that apply to almost all the numbers I give you. First, they are exclusively about non-Hispanic whites. Why is that? Because if I didn't do that, every audience I talked to would be saying to themselves, well, to what extent is this a national problem? To what extent is this really focused in the black community or the Latino community or some other group? By focusing on whites, all of that extra set of considerations goes away. Second thing is that most of the numbers I give you are going to be based on people ages 30 to 49. And I chose those years because that's the prime of life. And we've had lots of changes in the age of marriage and the age of retirement that changed the nature of the 20s and changed the nature of the 50s and 60s in people. 30s and 40s are still the prime of life now as they were in 1960. Okay, with those limitations in mind, let's talk about marriage. 1960, among the upper middle class means college educated, working in a managerial position or in one of the professions. In the upper middle class, 94% were married in that age group. I mean, talk about a universal social institution. But among the working class, and by that I mean no more than a high school education and working in a blue-collar job or a low-level service job, in the white working class, you had 84% married. It was the overwhelming social norm through which communities are organized. Now you go to 2010, 50 years later. Among the upper middle class, you still got 84% married. Not only do you still have 84% married, the situation is getting better rather than worse. That percentage has been stable since about the mid-1980s, and divorce has been going down during that period, so a lot more of that 84% are on first marriages now than they were 20 or 30 years ago. Marriage is doing fine in the white upper middle class. In the white working class, not 2010, ages 30 to 49, 48% were married. A third of the males in that age group have never been married. Among the white working class, about half of all children are now born to unmarried women. These are numbers that we used to associate with the inner city, all right? This is not the inner city. This is something drastic that has happened to a central cultural institution. I am not speaking to you as a social conservative. I'm speaking to you as a social scientist who is stating no more than the empirical fact that we have studied to a fare thee well the ways in which children flourish under different family structures. We, meaning scholars on both the left and the right, we have controlled for income, we've controlled for race, we've controlled for maternal education, and all sorts of other things. And after you do all that, one of the best kept secrets on a really important topic is that children born and living with two biological parents married do statistically a whole lot better on just about any outcome you can mention, whether it is from performance in school to the likelihood they're going to be in jail, to the likelihood they're going to have drug abuse, to the likelihood that they will be employed as adults. The next best set of outcomes are associated with children growing up with a single parent who has been married and then divorced. And whether the person is remarried or not doesn't seem to make much difference. In a statistical sense, step-parents, neither one way or the other. By far, the worst outcomes are associated, after controlling for income, maternal education, and the rest, by far the first outcomes are children born to never married women. I say it's the best kept secret because what I have just said is widely acknowledged among liberal and conservative scholars alike who follow the data, and it's something that politicians of both the Democratic and Republican parties are scared to say, because you have an increasingly large population among the voters that they don't want to alienate for one reason, but it is an important social phenomenon that affects the flourishing of children. The second reason that these numbers on marriage are really important is that marriage is the source of a great deal of the social capital that makes communities work. A great deal of what goes into volunteering, what goes on to being active and trying to deal with community problems, joining local organizations, helping with fund drives. A whole lot of that is based on the fact that you have two parents trying to create an environment for their children. The fact is that unmarried dads don't coach Little League teams. And unmarried moms, never married moms, don't have time to be going to too many PTA meetings or otherwise engage in the community. Social capital, and again, this is not a political statement. Robert Putnam of the Kennedy School has written extensively on this. Social capital collapses when you have a reduction in marriage of the kind we've seen. I focused on marriage so much because it's such a central institution. But in fact, if you talk about the formation of the new lower class, you've got lots of other things you've got to worry about. For example, males in the labor force. In 1960, if you were a male ages 30 to 49 and you were not paraplegic, you were supposed to be working or looking for work. If you did not do that, you were a bum. And accordingly, almost everybody in either the working class or the upper middle class, males of that age group, were in the labor force. By 2008, a year that I choose because that's before the meltdown and the growth in unemployment, before that, we were up to 1 out of 8 white males ages 30 to 49 in the working class who were not even in the labor force. They were not looking for work. Furthermore, those numbers continued to rise throughout good years and bad. During full employment economies and recessions alike, those numbers have gone up, 1 out of 8. Religiosity. Here's an interesting, an additional situation in which we're talking about a cultural institution in which there used to be participation across the classes, and things have changed big time. Here's what most of us, including me, thought when I went into this research, that, well, yeah, you have the elites that have become secular and godless and secular humanists, but religionists, you know, that's the working class is the bulwark of religion. Well, it doesn't work out that way. If you consider religiosity to consist of saying that you go to church just about every week or more often, and that you have a strong attachment to your faith, it's declined across the board, but it has declined somewhat in the upper middle class. It has plunged in the working class. So you're now down to about 12% of whites in the working class who say those things about their faith, which is about a third of what it was 50 years ago. Why is that important? Because if we're talking about social capital, that thing which makes communities work, Robert Putnam in Bowling alone calculates that about 50% of all giving, 50% of all volunteering, and 50% of participation in organizations is directly religious in terms of social capital. And not only that, people who are religious also tend to be engaged much more deeply in secular forms of social capital. So when you see that kind of plunge in religiosity in the working class, that too is associated with the breakdown of communities. This is not statistical in terms of its effects. And those of you who are working in this field know what I'm talking about when I say that you don't need to go to the inner city of Cleveland to see communities that don't function anymore. You can find them in Ohio in lots of small towns where you've got meth epidemics, where you've got all kinds of problems that you just didn't see 30, 40 years ago, and that they are getting worse all the time. That it's not a racial problem, it's happening in white communities. It is a serious threat to the ability of the nation to sustain its civic culture in the way it has in the past. Let me turn to the new upper class, because that's a different kind of problem. It's a very different kind of phenomenon. And in this case, it's especially odd because so much of the problem is not from people doing bad things, but people doing what comes naturally with longer-term results that they didn't anticipate, but they need to worry about. Let me tell you what I mean. You had two phenomena going on during the course of the 20th century, picking up in speed after about 1950. The first of these was that brains became much more valuable in the marketplace, just sheer, raw intellectual ability. An example. Suppose you think of a person that you know, because all of us have met this kind of person, who is really, really good at math, but is a complete social klutz. You know, you wouldn't trust the guy to go across the street to buy you a loaf of bread, but terrific, you know, and no math, you don't want to introduce him to any of your friends as a potential blind date or anything like that. But what could that person do to make a living in 1920? He could teach math, maybe. If he didn't have any social skills, even that would be a problem. He could be an actuary. The guy was looking at not very many choices in job opportunities. Take precisely the same skill set now. It turns out that really, really high math ability is highly correlated with really good programming ability. That same guy with the same skill set and the same defects can decide between a six-figure offer from Microsoft or Google, or he can listen to the quants in New York City who will offer him realistic prospects of wealth beyond the wildest dreams of avarice. These are actually things you can do with that skill set. But for that matter, look at lawyers. Maybe this is not the best crowd in which to... Okay, suppose you were a lawyer in 1920. What kind of income could you expect to get? You were probably going to be one of the better off people in town, but you would have private clients who could afford to pay the kinds of fees that, for legal services they needed. So you'd be well off, but you would not get fabulously wealthy. You could be a corporate lawyer, in which case you'd make a corporate salary, which is good, but also is not great wealth. Suppose now you are not just a lawyer, but you're a really smart lawyer. You have a very high ability to deal with complex intellectual tasks. Well, you've got a whole bunch of things you have available to do now that weren't available then, such as, suppose you can negotiate a complex multinational business deal or merger. You can be worth a commission of millions of dollars. Suppose you can expertly navigate the labyrinth of Washington, a regulatory state, and get a favorable ruling for a corporation from one of the regulatory agencies that could make differences of $100 million to the bottom line of that corporation. You are worth a four-figure per hour fee. You can make a whole lot of money if you are an intellectually very capable lawyer. Same thing went on throughout the economy. Brains became a whole lot more valuable in the marketplace. Second thing that went on was that we got very good at identifying intellectual talent wherever it existed and shipping it off to the best colleges. Here's an example for you. I imagine a number of you in this room have had children who have wanted to apply to elite colleges. Well, in 1952, if they'd wanted to apply to Harvard, here are the parameters. The median SAT verbal score in 1952 was about 583. That's nothing to write home about. It's very low, as all of you who remember your SAT scores know. The same Harvard freshman entering class 8 years later, in 1960, the median SAT verbal score was up in the high 600s. Over the course of 8 years, Harvard went from a place with a lot of rich kids and a few smart ones to a place with a whole lot of smart kids and a few rich ones. It was a complete change in the nature of the undergraduate student body, and that also went on throughout the country. It's good. That's great. You're taking an elite institution and you are opening it up to merit and hard work and intelligence and the rest of it. That's great. The problem is that these two things have been going on now for 50 years, generation after generation of kids going through, and a variety of things happen because of that. One of the things is that if you take the really smart kid from a small town in Ohio and send him off to Harvard, he no longer marries a girl from the small town in Ohio, who the girl next door may have been really nice, but she was not explicitly selected for IQ. If you are marrying your classmate at Harvard, that person has been explicitly selected for IQ. Or, since you're probably not going to get married right out of college, who do you marry if you are a successful corporate executive who's getting married at 34 or something like that. You're getting married to the lawyer who's been litigating against you in court and you thought was really cute. But she's from Yale Law School and she was explicitly selected for IQ. These kinds of anecdotal things, if you doubt me, go take a look at the Sunday Times marriage page on, the New York Sunday Times, or mergers and acquisitions, as it's sometimes called. What I'm talking about is going on. What happens there is you start, however, to get a distinctive culture that has taken hold in educated, affluent America. It covers everything. We get married later, because we in this room are a member of the group I'm talking about. Get married much later than we used to, in our 30s. We have somewhat different child-rearing practices. We read different books. We see different television shows, and increasingly we are isolated from the rest of America. I have a quiz in the book in which I try to drive this home. It's called How Thick Is Your Bubble? And it has 25 items in it, maximum score of 100. A high score means that you are not in a bubble. And some of the questions are kind of obvious. Have you ever lived for at least a year in a neighborhood in which half of the people did not have college degrees? Have you ever lived at least a year during some part of your life when your estimated family income was below the poverty line, and so forth? Others of the questions are kind of mischievous. In the course of the past year, have you or your spouse ever stocked your fridge with a mass-market American beer? The reason I ask that is that the new upper class despises mass-market American beer. The beer has to be made by Belgian elves, or they won't buy it. But there are other questions that I think get to some really serious problems. Have you ever walked on a factory floor? I don't ask, have you ever worked on a factory floor? I'm saying, have you ever been in that environment where everything you wear and use and the rest of it is manufactured? I think my favorite question in the whole thing is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? If you cannot answer yes to that question, you are fundamentally unable to empathize with the large proportion of the population who still holds jobs that cause body parts to hurt at the end of the day. In all of this, we have a generational issue that is very serious. It's okay if you now live on Park Avenue and have a net worth of $50 million, if you spent your summers working as a taxi driver or otherwise grew up in a middle-class or working-class neighborhood. Because you may be living on Park Avenue now, but you still remember what it was like. You could be put onto Main Street of Topeka, Kansas tomorrow, and you could get along just fine. You would understand the social cues. You would be in familiar territory. How about our children? To what extent does the next generation grows up in an affluent family, only goes to schools which are attended by other children from affluent upper middle class families, at least, or higher than that? So if they're going to a really good private school, much different from that. They then go from those schools to selective colleges, where they are again surrounded by people like that. Or do they go to an honors program at a school like Ohio State, which is a big college, just a big university with lots of different things, but they're in kind of a bubble within that college. When they go out for their summer jobs, they do not work construction anymore. They do internships, also known as affirmative action for the rich. Because who else can afford to take an unpaid internship except the child of parents who are footing the bill and can afford to foot the bill and they don't need to make money over the summer? And then they go to graduate school, and then they move seamlessly from there into a high-paying job as a lawyer or going to work for McKinsey or whatever. And I'm talking about not your average college graduate. I'm talking about increasingly the life history of the people who are increasingly running the country. And that's a problem. And it's not a problem because they're bad people. On the contrary, they're trying very hard to be good people usually. But they don't get this country in some fundamental way. Think of it this way. Suppose you have a truck driver who does not understand the priorities of a Yale law professor. That's fine. That makes no difference. But if you have Yale law professors arguing cases before the Supreme Court, or you have news anchor people reporting the news, or you have a cabinet secretary making policy on whatever in Washington, and they don't understand the priorities of truck drivers, you got a problem. If they cannot remember from their own lives things which enable them to know how other people live, the rest of the country lives, you're going to end up with bad policy. You're going to end up with mistakes being made. And I think we see, and this is not a partisan statement either, this has been going on for a long time, we see that in a whole lot of what has been happening to our body politic. But worse than that, worse than the specific political implications of it, are the difference in the separation. Maybe I can give you an illustration of this. If you're saying to yourself, you know, this has always been a problem. We've always had rich neighborhoods where the powerful people lived. Let me give you an example. I've picked out 12 neighborhoods that were already known as elite neighborhoods in 1960. North Shore, Chicago, Upper East Side of New York, Southern Westchester County, Northwest Washington, 14 of those, Beverly Hills, California, 14 neighborhoods that were where the rich and famous people lived in 1960. I took census tract data to reconstruct the income and education in those 14 neighborhoods, okay? 1960 census, for these 14 neighborhoods, the median family income was $84,000, expressed in today's dollars. That is not affluence. That's not even really upper middle class. That's middle class. That's not that you didn't have rich people living in those neighborhoods. You did. But they were cheek by jowl with a lot of other people who weren't rich. The percentage of adults in those neighborhoods who had college degrees in 1960 was 26%. The typical couple, even in a place like the North Shore of Chicago or the Upper East Side of New York, consisted of one member of the couple who had a college degree and another member who had a high school education. What that meant is you had a great deal of built-in cultural heterogeneity within the neighborhood, even the most elite neighborhoods. Plus you had a situation in which almost all of those rich people around the country had themselves grown up in working class and middle class neighborhoods. In 2000, 2010 censuses, of course, those same 14 neighborhoods, you're looking at about $164,000 median income. You're looking at 76% of all of the adults with college degrees. But more than that, you're looking with a whole lot of those people with advanced degrees, MBAs, PhDs, law degrees, and the rest of it. And the whole nature of the isolation in the bubble has increased a lot. Well, now we come to the solutions part of the speech. What do we do next? I do have a chapter in the book where I talk about that. I have a pessimistic scenario and an optimistic scenario. Let's start with the pessimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is that all is lost, that we are already going to become just another wealthy country with an elite on top that's doing very well, and a large lower class that is not really expected to fully participate in the society. They will be cared for in terms of economic sustenance and the rest of that through a European-style social welfare state, and that'll take care of the problem. We won't have people starving in the streets. The only problem with this is we will no longer be America. The pessimistic scenario also says, you know what? In its own way, this new elite, I'm not talking about the upper middle class anymore, I'm talking about the people who run the country, are as dysfunctional in their own way as the new lower class is. You know, there is historically a characteristic that occurs with all successful civilizations on the way up. This has been noted by a variety of historians, most famously Arnold Toynbee, but also others. And that is the elite is characterized by the real confidence in the rightness of their own values, in the rightness of what they are doing. And essentially, they carry the rest of the society along with them. And that certainly has happened. Take a look at Victorian England, where you basically had an elite that propagandized the entire country into buying into the upper class, the rising merchant classes, very strict sense of morality and behavior and so forth. And as a result, you had in London, in the last half of the 19th century, when it was urbanizing at an incredibly rapid rate, you had crime go down because of the confidence of the new elite in propagandizing its values. The new upper class in the United States has no confidence in its own values whatsoever. Non-judgmentalism is the order of the day. So the upper class still gets married in themselves, but they would never ever say that that's better, a better way for people to live their lives. They will not preach what they practice. I use that phrase in the book, and I'm afraid it's gotten interpreted as meaning that I want members of the upper class to go with bullhorns down to the working class and stand in street corners. That's not what I mean. I mean I want people who are writing television scripts for sitcoms and people who are reporting the news and academics who are writing academic papers and politicians who are making policy to be quite clear in their own minds about what values are needed for a civic culture like the United States to function, and not be afraid to have these reflected in the way they go about their work. And that's what we don't see. We also see, I think, in the new upper class, an end to the concept of unseemliness. There are many people in this room who are old enough to know that I am not being nostalgic when I say that corporate executives in 1960 who could have easily afforded to buy Cadillacs often did not do so. And they did not do so because to do so would be flaunting their wealth. It would be getting too big for their britches. I come from Iowa, and I bet you in Ohio know what that phrase means too, getting too big for their britches. And they wouldn't do it. They would not have considered building a 20,000 square foot house, even though they could have afforded to do that, because that would really be getting too big for your britches. There was a sense also of things that were not against the law, but you wouldn't do because they would be unseemly. And as far as I can tell, that concept has disappeared as well. So you have a new upper class that is doing very well, thank you, economically and politically and every other way, but that, as far as I can tell, A, doesn't understand how the rest of the country lives, and B, is doing a very bad job of sensing its obligations to the rest of the country, not in terms of how much taxes they pay, but their obligations to the rest of the society, both as setting examples for it and being connected with it. That's the pessimistic scenario. The optimistic scenario says that lots of people have gone broke by underestimating the capacity of the United States to renew itself. We have had a series of great awakenings in this country in the past, religious great awakenings, which have actually turned the culture on a dime. In the 1820s, the alcohol consumption of the average American, which in 1820 was some unbelievably high figure, plunged over the course of 10 years because of one of the religious great awakenings that occurred then. There are a variety of things that are going on in the society that give me some reason to be optimistic that the problems I am talking about are ones whose time has come. As I've talked to audiences like this in the past, I much more often get the response, yeah, I've been worrying about this kind of thing myself already, as opposed to, gee, that never crossed my mind before. I hear lots of parents worried about the isolation of their children from a lot of the influences and experiences that have made themselves successful. I hear lots of nervousness about a variety of the other kinds of isolation that we've seen. That's good. We are also going to, I think, see over the next decade examples in front of us that are going to give us pause. We are going to see what goes on in Europe, which is the canary in the coal mine with a lot of these trends. And I don't think that will be a pretty sight, and I think that we will see a need to reform a variety of practices. Whether that will happen? Well, if I had to bet a significant amount of the Murray net worth on it, I would say the pessimistic scenario is the more likely one. However, the tenacity of Americans' affection for the traditional American civic culture is there. America has been different in kinds of ways that we know because we live here and are sometimes hard to articulate, but we have always been proud of being Americans as opposed to being rich Americans or poor Americans. We have always wanted to identify historically with being members of the middle class because part of being an American was to have a sense of identity with other Americans. That continuing affection and allegiance to that civic culture is there. What I am trying to do is to, as much as it's within my capacity, say to people that civic culture that we treasure is in great jeopardy. And to the extent that all the people who care about what has made America exceptional buy into that message and start talking about it, the cultural changes that we need are possible. Thank you very much.
You know, this organization is all about civic discourse, and tremendous presentation. And I think the intelligence factor, the number 7 in the world, maybe got a little bit
I have
higher.
high expectations.
I do too. I do too. As we usually do, we will take questions from the audience, and CMC records our forums for statewide broadcast on the Ohio channel. They're also available on YouTube. You get there through our website. While you come to the microphone, please introduce yourself, and we thank you in advance for not making long editorial comments. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Jim Coe with WCBE Public Radio. Thank you. That was very revealing. I'd like to see what your research has revealed about voting patterns with the upper middle class in comparison with the working class. If I understood you correctly, when you were speaking of the issue of unmarried couples or unmarried people and single mothers raising children, I think you indicated that this was something that our leaders in Washington are well aware of but afraid to say anything about, if I understood you correctly.
The outcomes, what we know empirically about the outcomes for children, they've been very reluctant to talk about. Yeah.
So as far as voters, intuitively, it seems like the upper middle class vote and perhaps some of the working class don't vote. Am I correct on that?
There are much higher voter participation rates by education, yeah.
So what are the leaders in Washington afraid of?
It's a very natural phenomenon. Nobody wants to be a bad guy. Look, demonizing single mothers who are not making much money and trying to do their best is something that conservative Republicans shrink from every bit as much as liberal Democrats. It's not just that they are afraid of losing their votes. They don't want to be seen in that light. I don't want to be seen in that light. Who does? I mean, it used to be okay. It used to be okay that, you know, these Jezebels who could be written off. I have actually, and I'm no longer being facetious on this, I understand why we don't want to demonize single mothers. What's wrong with demonizing the men? If you have a man who has impregnated a woman and walked away from that responsibility, call him a bum, openly. Don't say he's made bad choices. He's a bum. And once you can start doing that openly, I think that'll be a major part of the solution. There has to be a stigmatization of behavior that is fundamentally irresponsible about the most important moral decision that most of us in this room have ever made, and that is to bring a child into the world. I'm sorry, I went off on a rant, but that's the answer to your question.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is John McKnight, and you'll have to bear with me for a minute here while I turn the statement into a question here, but in my opinion, I believe that an unfortunate result or nature of a truly capitalistic society which we live in, is this separation of the classes that we're experiencing. And I don't say that with pride necessarily. It just seems to me to be the algorithm that that we are living in this capitalistic society is going to result in that. And much of the things that you talked about today, I see as being a result of the separation of the classes and not a cause. When you talked about the percentage of white males 30 to 49 that are not working in comparison to what it used to be, and the percentage of people that are married in that same class, compared to what it used to be, and the meth use and all of this, seems to me to be a result of the separation. And if that's correct, then trying to address those issues as a means to correct the separation of the classes, while it may accomplish some good, is not going to accomplish the goal. I'm not sure what is necessary to accomplish the goal, given my my opinion that that's not
Now
the
I am
cause.
having a hard time figuring out what your question is.
Well, I guess my question is, what? Disagree with that. What is your rebuttal to that? Why am I wrong? Because unless you can tell me why I'm wrong, I don't believe that I am. I think these problems in society are a result of the separation, and they're not the cause of it. And trying to address them as the cause is wrong.
Well, at first, in the course of the book, I deliberately avoid talking about causes for the new lower class. And the reason I did that is I wanted people of the left to be able to read the book without throwing it against the wall. And I am on record as what I think triggered a great many of these social trends. The drop in marriage, the increase in out-of-wedlock births, dropout from the workforce. It's in a book called Losing Ground, published in 1984, and I stand behind that analysis. But the issue is this. No matter what the cause was originally, it's not necessarily going to give us any guidance about what to do now, because over time, the dynamics change. Let's go back to the issue of having babies without getting married. There were changes in the rules of the game for low-income women in the 1960s that made it seem in the short term a lot more reasonable to go ahead and have a baby and keep it than it had seemed before. The economic penalties were lifted in some significant way for low-income women. And I can say, well, that sort of got the ball rolling. But once you no longer have one girl in a high school class that's gotten pregnant, but rather you have 10, the stigma goes away too. So you're no longer looking at a phenomena which is driven by those original changes in the rules. You're looking at a phenomena that's taken on a life of its own. If you're the only guy in your neighborhood who is not looking for work, you are stigmatized and you are a bum. Hey, if it's 12% of the guys in your neighborhood who aren't, you're part of a subculture, and you have lots of validation from the guys who are behaving just like you. Not only that, at that point, you have guys who do get low-paying jobs who are jeered for taking low-paying jobs as being beneath their dignity. So I'm not just backing off from the question of causes originally. I'm saying whatever caused it originally isn't necessarily that relevant now. And if we're going to talk about solutions, it's going to have to be because of fundamental cultural changes in how these questions are perceived, and that will involve, among other things, a re-stigmatization of a variety of behaviors.
I guess that seems to me as though it's just addressing changes that have occurred in society that what didn't used to exist then that are inherent into today's society. Yeah, I'll move on. Thank you.
Hi there, Sean Kurtner. I'm a guest here today. So you talk about the divisions in socioeconomic classes, and in large part, it seems to me, and I've read some of your stuff, that the divisions are people divide themselves, and there are some divisions, but one of the common things that both elements are exposed to or receive equally is mass entertainment, or what passes as entertainment. And my question to you is, how do you affect, or what would you do about the cultural decline? As a libertarian, how would you impact or affect the need for a cultural reawakening, or some way arrest and reverse the cultural decline when it comes to mass media and what passes as entertainment? Because that seems to be a real driver in some of these underlying issues that you talk about.
Yeah, first, the short answer to your question is, as a libertarian, I can't do much more than jawbone about these things. But let me expand on that a little bit to say, look, let's say you are the writer for Girls. And any of you in the audience watch Girls? Not very many of you. That's one of the things about the new upper class. They watch Downton Abbey, and that's about it. Okay. Let's take an abstract sitcom or a dramatic show.
16 and pregnant.
In the 1950s and 60s, yes, you had rules which said you couldn't use profanity on TV, but actually the basic rules about what you couldn't do on TV then were about the same as they are now. But the choice of content that was made by the people who produced and wrote those shows was wildly different. You had in Hollywood, yes, you had the production code, but a large part of the reason that you had the production code was the people who ran the movie industry at that time explicitly saw one of their functions as being that of lifting up certain kinds of ways of behaving and of demonizing other kinds of ways of behaving. They were quite conscious of doing that. The reason it changed from the way it was then to the way it is now is because of shifts in cultural values. And the way it's going to change from the way it is now to a better way is going to be because of shifts in cultural values. And a great deal of this is going to involve becoming highly judgmental, all of us, in our conversations around dinner tables, in just the way we carry ourselves in our lives. And without that, nothing's going to change.
My name is Tom Harvey. I'm a retired business executive who teaches part-time at Fisher College at Ohio State. And first of all, thank you for telling us, this room, that half of us are below average. I appreciate that insight. I am a upper middle class, raised in an upper middle class family, went to one of those elite colleges that you mentioned in your book, and but grew up in the 60s. And the great homogenizer for me was compulsory military service. In other words, through the military, I met America.
Yep.
And I hadn't met America before. Wouldn't a return to compulsive government service, let's say, or even military service, help this problem dramatically?
The short answer, again, is that your experience is absolutely typical, but that it is utterly infeasible on a national scale. First, in terms of the military, we just simply would only need a fraction of America's youth to go into it. But if you start to run a compulsory public service, 2 years of service kind of thing, it will not have the uniform code of military justice behind it. I mean, the reason you can take draftees and make them into soldiers is because you do have the uniform code of military justice. If you don't do what the drill instructor says, you are in a world of hurt. And that is not going to, listen, I was in Peace Corps, all right? Which everybody was a volunteer. I want to tell you that the kind of administration you're going to get for national public service would be like we got in Peace Corps. What would happen is, in effect, you'd have this large majority of kids who wouldn't want to be in it in the first place. They would figure out how to game the system. And my own view is it probably increase rather than decrease the antagonism among groups. There are things you can do, however. And as parents, for example, insist your kids get real jobs in the summer. And if it means flipping burgers at McDonald's, great. They will learn a lot flipping burgers at McDonald's about a lot of different things. Do small things, like if you're going to go to Aspen, for your skiing vacation, drive. Put your kids in the car and stay at Motel 6s, that's a small thing. But I wrote a piece in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago advocating that people play poker. I'm probably going to spend the rest of the afternoon out at Hollywood Casino, west of town here. I'm serious. The poker room is the most socio-democratically egalitarian place in the world. But there are lots of ways that people who live in this room, who are in this room, can live their lives that put them in a lot more contact with the rest of America than we do. I actually shouldn't pick on this room. In Columbus, Ohio, you are so much more in contact than you are if you live in Northwest Washington or the Upper East Side of New York. There's just no comparison. You guys are actually pretty healthy in this regard, but I'm speaking metaphorically.
We've got time for one more question. Thank you.
I'm Toonie King. I'm here as a guest today. I'd like to lay before you a couple of concepts and get your reaction to them. One is, when I grew up, a strong back and a good work ethic would probably get you into the middle class. That doesn't seem to happen anymore with the change in our economy and what goes on in our society. And the second thing is, when I grew up, the thought was, wherever you started, there was still the chance you could dramatically improve your position. And seems to me we've lost that as well, that people are constantly told the system is rigged against you. Yeah. You're not going to succeed. What do you think are the long-term implications of those two concepts?
Well, with the idea that you can't start at the bottom and work hard and get in the middle class, you've got a very large growing Asian population that just is making a lie of that. You know, and I don't mean the kids who are coming here and going to elite schools. I mean the families who are coming here and you know, everybody works 2 jobs and saves their money and buys a dry cleaning business. I mean, they're just moving into the middle class all the time. This is not to say that we haven't had stagnation of wages in working class jobs. We have, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at immigrant groups, they're making the transition to the middle class in the old-fashioned way. But another aspect of what you asked about, I think, is, okay, I'll make this brief because I can go into 10 minutes in this without a bit of worry. I think that our system of higher education is fundamentally dysfunctional. We have taken this piece of paper that is increasingly meaningless, called a BA, that requires 4 years of residential stay in an expensive place, and if you don't have that piece of paper, there are all sorts of jobs you can't even interview for, even though they don't remotely require advanced skills. Employers are just using it as a rough screen for perseverance and a certain degree of intelligence. And that we desperately need to get rid of this very artificial barrier, that expensive barrier, a system which is leading all sorts of young people with very high skills in some areas to try to develop their skills that aren't so good in the college setting because they don't want to be second-class citizens. And we defined having a BA as sort of the prerequisite for being a first-class citizen. And that a major reform in higher education could do a lot to reopen a lot of these avenues for advancement that are now closed. They were good questions from the 7th smartest city in the world.
I know it's among the 7. Yeah.
You may be first.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this.
Stick around for a few comments. I know you enjoyed today's forum. You can see it again and share it with a friend on YouTube through the CMC website. If Charles is around for a little bit longer before he goes to the poker table, so we have coffee and cookies out in front. We can continue the conversation. Don't forget, we recycle our name badges. If you want more information about CMC, put your card in that and drop it in the basket. Register for next week's Meet the Press. We got a lot of good people coming. Thanks to the Dispatch, the Center for Community Solutions, and particularly for our speaker, Charles Murray. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here.